So would you please introduce yourself and then tell me a little bit about GEOS and what you do?
Sure. I'm Tonya Graham. I'm the Executive Director of the GEOS Institute. We are a nonprofit based in Ashland, Oregon, and we work primarily with communities to help them understand the impacts of climate change and to work to build resilience that is both nature-based and socially equitable.
Well, that sounds amazing. So let's unpack that a little bit. You work with communities and you work to build resilience, and this is around climate, I think, climate change. Sometimes we hear the words mitigation and adaptation applied to resilience, and can you sort of help me understand what that means, and what do you do? How do you help these communities be more resilient? In what way?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a great question because the language in the climate world is a moving target. Adaptation is pretty clear. It is how do we adapt to the impacts that are underway and are coming. Mitigation is really that work that we do to address the causes of climate change. So atmospheric carbon, how do we limit our emissions? How do we pull carbon out of the atmosphere? That sort of thing is mitigation. Resilience has been a really interesting term because sometimes people use it to mean adaptation. They just use it interchangeably with adaptation. But the field is really moving towards a broader definition that includes both the adaptation work and the mitigation work under this larger umbrella of resilience. And that's the definition that we choose to use. We do primarily adaptation work, but a lot of the goals that we're working toward are to make sure that communities have access to that full breadth of climate resilience services, so both adaptation and mitigation services.
Okay, so can you give me some examples? Like how does this really look at the scale of a community? We've in my class just two of my students went to COP26 in Glasgow and sort of watched the sausage being made in terms of international climate policy. And actually, some people were pretty unhappy about the results. One of my students in particular who went to COP26 came back depressed about the kind of mess that is international negotiations about climate change. And my own sense is that your work with communities is perhaps more directly helpful to people than trying to negotiate big treaties that nobody wants to agree to. How does it really work with a community? Help me understand that.
Well, your students, I think, are some of them are experiencing the frustration of what it takes to move things through government, which is always slower, and it's never quite as robust as we would want it to be. And that sausage making process is very frustrating to be part of. But climate action needs to happen at all levels of government. So we need those international treaties. We need federal legislation, regulatory reform, incentive programs that work across all 50 states. But we also need work done at the state level. There are specific parts of the law that are held by the state. And then there are other elements that are done very much at the local level. And at the GEOS Institute, we focus on that local level of action. And so when you look at climate action plans, they are most generally done at some sort of local government level. It's either a county level plan, or it's a city level plan, or sometimes it's a planning district level plan. But that's really kind of where the rubber meets the road in terms of a lot of investment going right into the ground and either building climate resilient infrastructure and programs or doing things the way that they've always been done. And so there are definitely linkages between those levels of government, but that local government level is very important because it can't solve the climate crisis by itself, but we really can't solve the climate crisis without local governments taking action across the country. And so what we do, the way that it looks for us, is that we come in at a variety of places with a local community to help them. So In some places, we lead the process for them. They contract with us and we just lead them all the way through a planning process so that they come out the other side with a climate adaptation plan. In other situations with our Climate Ready Communities program, we help communities that are largely doing this planning themselves, and we bring in capacity as they need help. The nice thing is that the climate field has converged around a common set of steps for a community to undergo when they're doing, particularly I'll speak to climate adaptation planning. It's similar on mitigation, but it's a different set of steps. So in climate adaptation planning, you start by developing relationships with stakeholders, making sure that the community is, the key players in the community are involved in this process and are going to be tracking along with it. And then you start to look at the science. And so what does the science tell us about what has already changed in this particular location and what the trends look like going forward? And we always make sure that we share those trends based on the business as usual. We don't get our act together on emissions. And then also looking at what happens if we do make very significant changes in our emissions of greenhouse gases. And so communities get to see that difference in what their future looks like based on what they do on the carbon side. And we think that's a very important part of this process, because we know we can't adapt our way out of runaway climate change. And so these two elements really do need to work together. But once a community looks at their projections, then the question is, well, what does that mean in this particular community? The communities are different, and where they're situated, where they're located, how they've developed across the landscape, what drives their economy, what their culture looks like. All of those things create different vulnerabilities depending on where you are. So you could have very similar projections in a big city and a rural community, and you'll have very different vulnerabilities depending on what that looks like. So in the city, perhaps you might see a major health impact from increased pollution because they already have a pollution problem, right? So those health impacts are going to be bigger in a heat wave situation, say. In that rural community, their biggest problem with a heat wave may be that they've got elderly people scattered across the landscape in this very rural, dispersed way, and they don't know where they are. So when they have a heat wave, their health problem isn't that they have asthma and lung problems. Their problem is that they've got people with heat illnesses that are dispersed across the landscape. So it really does matter what those vulnerabilities are in a particular community. Once those are identified, then the question becomes, well, what are you going to do about them? And that's that strategy development angle. So taking those prioritized vulnerabilities and identifying strategies for each one of them to make sure that your community is actually dealing with the vulnerabilities that they've decided are the most important. And then, of course, community engagement needs to happen all through this so that the community understands, why are we looking at this? What are we learning, and why is action important? Because at the end of the day, the whole point is to implement the plan. So once the plan is put in place, if the community has come along with it, then there's a lot more motivation to actually invest in implementing the plan. And for us at the GEOS Institute, what we focus on is in that vulnerability assessment space and in the strategy development place, we want to make sure that underrepresented communities are in that room, because they experience our community systems in a different way than other people do. And if they're not in that room to identify the vulnerabilities, then the community could miss very important ones that really are focused on those particular populations. We also work in the strategy development part of this to make sure that the strategies developed are good for natural systems. So we know that natural systems are experiencing the same kind of climate impacts as communities are at the same time. And so we need to make sure that those strategies are integrating across both the human and natural system.
Wow, it sounds hard. And also kind of striking when I think about climate impacts on communities around the US and for that matter around the world. Different kinds of places have different kinds of impacts that are sort of front and center. So in the Western US these days, we're dealing with drought and with fire and with smoke from wildfires. On the other hand, in some parts of the world, it's really all about coastal flooding and storms and eroding coastlines and things like that. So I guess working with communities also involves, well, as you've just described, it involves differences in the communities themselves and how they're structured and how their populations are dispersed and what their vulnerabilities are. And it also has to do with where they're situated in the world and what kinds of impacts are coming at them.
Yeah, that's exactly true. And I think that that's why localized planning is so powerful, because we work with a framework that we developed. It's called Whole Community Resilience. And that framework can allow any community anywhere to look at those climate risks that are particular to them. So if you're in Colorado, you're not looking at sea level rise. If
Right.
you're down in Alabama, permafrost melt is not your problem.
Right.
But whatever your problem happens to be, you can take your community through this standardized process, because it's not cookie cutter. It really is customizable so that communities can look at what is the particular issue that they're up against. But that's where, for us, we believe very strongly not only in making sure that these processes are based on credible science, but also involve the people who run that community's systems, because no one knows them better. And no one knows the impacts on the people in that community better than the people themselves. And so it's really important that this technical assistance that's offered to communities is met by those communities and their participation. Because they'll say things, it's always just interesting to be in the room. We do workshops as part of this process. And we'll have 40 or 50 people in a room from a community, and they're broken up into sectors, and then we mix them up later and that sort of thing. But they will identify things that an outside consultant would have never known.
Huh.
And they'll also say, well, actually, that's not a problem because of this and that. And an outside consultant would have never known that. And so that is a really important part of this. And we've also just found that when a person is talking about their community and they're looking at projections that affect them and maybe their farms or their children, or smoke and air quality levels and that sort of thing, that polarization tends to fall away a little bit. I think that localized level is really a place where these climate conversations can happen in a different way than what happens at the COP meetings or at the national political level.
Yeah, that's very powerful. Last thing I'd kind of like to touch on is opportunities for students in this line of work. So, if you're coming out of college with a degree in sustainability or environmental management or something like that, what would you suggest to somebody like that who wants to do community work on resilience? How can they help?
It's a great question, because this field doesn't have the same kind of training programs that other fields do. If you want to be a city planner, you go and get that degree and then you're sort of off to the races. But people come to the climate resilience world from a lot of different angles. And a lot of that training is kind of on the job training for it. But there's a couple of resources I think that your students might be interested in. One is the American Society of Adaptation Professionals. So that's a great place to meet other people who are already in the field. They have a mentorship program where they connect new people in the field to more experienced folks, and so they might check that out. The Association of Climate Change Officers has a credentialing program. Wow. Where folks can become they can get a climate change planning credential. That's another organization to have a look at. If depending on what state they're in, there may be programs like AmeriCorps where students are placed directly with communities to help them work on climate issues. So that's a potential stepping stone as well. It really depends again on what state they're in. And we don't know what's happening at this point, but there's a lot of talk about expanding the AmeriCorps program in just exactly this way. Wow. To help communities have capacity to do this kind of planning. But I would connect in with those professional societies. And there are a couple of schools that are starting to offer degree type programs. They're pretty early on yet, but they're out there. And so, the other thing would be the Urban Sustainability Directors Network. So if your students are coming out with sustainability degrees, USDN does a lot of work on climate resilience, and they are a great network to connect into. They may very well also have programs for young professionals.
Awesome. Well, this is super helpful. Is there anything else that you would like to pass on? Anything that I forgot to ask that you'd like to contribute?
I would just say that we need young professionals to come into this field. What we see is there is a different energy around young people. I think that this has always been the case, that they bring, you all, I guess I'm talking to your class, you all bring a very different energy to fields, to professions, and that sort of thing. And the work here is so critical, and we need people doing it in all levels of work. So no matter what the degree is, it's really important to be integrating climate into that. We're seeing all sorts of conversations now about decarbonizing the medical field and adaptation in emergency management, and almost, I would say, any field you go into, whether it's business or whatever it is, there is a place in there for climate action. And so that's what I would encourage folks to do, is just look for where in your chosen profession, if it's not this sort of planning, look for where you can integrate with these kinds of climate goals and these processes.
Well, thank you very, very much for your time. I think this has been super, and I look forward to sharing this with my class, and really appreciate the work you do, Tonya. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, Scott, and I hope all good things for your students.